The sterile chrome and glass conference room on the 50th floor of the One Vanderbilt skyscraper was meant to be the final stage for Julian Croft's latest triumph, a swift, clean divorce from his timid wife, Isabella. He smirked, adjusting his Patek Philippe watch, the ticking a countdown to his absolute freedom. His lawyers, a pack of tailored sharks, sat ready with papers that would leave her with a pittance, a mere footnote in his billion-dollar legacy. But as the heavy oak doors swung open, the woman who entered was not the one he remembered. Gone was the demure shadow. In her place stood a figure of chilling composure, her hand resting not on a tissue, but on a worn leather briefcase. In that moment, the ticking of his watch sounded less like a countdown and more like a time bomb, and Julian Croft was about to learn that in the world of the ultra-wealthy, the most dangerous secrets are often bound not in contracts but in blood. Julian Croft believed the world was his personal chessboard, and he its undisputed king. From his perch atop Croft Holdings, a sprawling conglomerate with tentacles in everything from tech to real estate, he moved people and assets with the same detached, calculating precision. His life was a meticulously curated collection of victories, the hostile takeovers, the record-breaking IPOs, and of course his marriage to Isabella. To the outside world, she was the perfect accessory. Beautiful, graceful, and most importantly, silent. She was the placid lake reflecting his towering ego. He had found her working as a translator at a conference in Geneva, her quiet intelligence a momentary amusement. He'd pursued her with the same relentless focus he applied to a corporate acquisition, showering her with a lifestyle that would have made royalty blush. He gave her a penthouse overlooking Central Park, a wardrobe filled with haute couture, and a black Amex with no conceivable limit. In return, he expected only one thing, her utter and complete compliance. For 5 years, she had played her part flawlessly. Today was the final act. The divorce. It was in his mind a simple transaction, a severing of a tie that had served its purpose. He had already lined up her replacement, a fiery Brazilian model with a social media following that rivaled a small country's population. The prenuptial agreement, a document as thick as a phone book and ironclad in its cruelty, was his masterpiece. It would grant Isabella a one-time payment of $5 million. A fortune to most, but to a man of Julian's stature, it was less than a rounding error. It was a final dismissive flick of the wrist. He sat at the head of the long, polished mahogany table in his lawyer's office, the skyline of Manhattan, a glittering testament to his power. Arthur Vance, his lead attorney, a man whose smile never quite reached his cold reptilian eyes, slid a pen across the table. "Everything is in order, Julian." Arthur said, his voice a low, confident purr. "She signs and you're free. Clean. The $5 million will be wired to her account within the hour." Julian leaned back, a smug smile playing on his lips. "And the non-disclosure. It's airtight, I trust. As a submarine, my friend." She so much as whispers the name Croft in a negative light, and she'll be back to translating instruction manuals for a living. The mood was jovial, celebratory. The air crackled with the kind of masculine arrogance that thrives in rooms where fortunes are made and lives are casually dismantled. They were masters of the universe, and this was just another Tuesday. Julian glanced at his watch again. She was late. 10 minutes late. The disrespect of it pricked at his ego. He had demanded punctuality from everyone in his life, from his board members to his household staff. For Isabella, his soon-to-be ex-wife, to defy this simple expectation on this day of all days was an infuriating act of rebellion. "Where is she?" he snapped, his good humor evaporating. Arthur shrugged a gesture of practiced nonchalance. "Traffic, perhaps, or maybe she's having a moment. It's a lot for a woman like her to process." Leaving all this, he gestured vaguely at the opulent surroundings. "She's not leaving it," Julian corrected him, his voice hard. "She's being removed from it. There's a difference." He stood and walked to the vast window, gazing down at the city below. He saw the ant-like people scurrying on the streets, the yellow cabs like tiny crawling insects. They were all part of his world, his kingdom. And Isabella. She was just one of them, a temporary resident in his elevated reality, now being sent back to the ground where she belonged. He thought of her pregnancy with a surge of irritation. It had been an unwelcome complication. Her tearful announcement 3 months ago had been met not with joy, but with cold fury. He had accused her of trapping him of a desperate last-ditch effort to secure her position. The timing was too convenient, too transparent. His response had been swift and brutal. He had moved her out of their shared bedroom that very night and instructed his lawyers to expedite the divorce proceedings. The child, he had decided, would be provided for, of course. A trust fund, the best schools, everything a Croft heir was entitled to. But the mother would be excised from the picture. He turned back to the room, his patience worn thin. "Get her on the phone, Arthur. Tell her I don't have all day." As Arthur reached for his phone, the double doors of the conference room swung open with a soft, expensive sigh. And there she was. The woman who stood in the doorway was Isabella, yet she was not. The change was so profound, so startling, that for a moment Julian felt a genuine sense of dislocation, as if he were looking at a stranger who bore a passing resemblance to his wife. The Isabella he knew would have entered such a room with her eyes downcast. Her shoulders slightly stooped as if apologizing for the space she occupied. She would have worn something soft and inoffensive, a cashmere sweater set in a muted tone of beige or dove grey. Her hair would have been pulled back in a simple, elegant chignon, her face a mask of quiet resignation. This woman was different. She wore a bespoke power suit of the deepest midnight blue, tailored to accommodate her subtle but visible baby bump. The cut was sharp, modern, and unapologetically expensive. Her hair, which she usually wore long and straight, was styled in soft, confident waves that framed a face he barely recognized. The makeup was minimal, but masterful, highlighting the fierce intelligence in her dark eyes and the resolute set of her jaw. She met his gaze directly without a flicker of fear or submission. It was a look of unnerving equality. But it was the object in her hand that truly sent a jolt through the room. It was not a designer handbag. It was a well-worn, dark brown leather briefcase, the kind favored by old-school lawyers and financiers. It was scuffed at the corners and bore the faint embossed initials E.C., Edward Croft, Julian's father. A stunned silence fell over the room. Arthur Vance, who had been halfway through dialing Isabella's number, slowly lowered his phone. His reptilian eyes wide with a confusion that bordered on alarm. Julian's other lawyers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their confident smirks replaced by frowns of bewilderment. Isabella walked into the room with a calm, deliberate stride. Her heels made a soft, rhythmic clicking sound on the marble floor, a sound that seemed to echo the sudden, frantic beating of Julian's heart. She didn't take the seat that had been designated for her at the far end of the table, the one that screamed visitor and outsider. Instead, She walked to the side of the table, placing the briefcase on the polished mahogany with a soft, definitive thud. "Julian." "Arthur," she said, her voice clear and steady, devoid of the tremor of emotion he had expected. "My apologies for the delay. I was finalizing some necessary paperwork." Julian found his voice, though it came out harsher than he intended. "What is this, Isabella? What's with the costume? And what in God's name are you doing with my father's briefcase?" He hadn't seen that briefcase in years, not since the day his father had died, leaving him the keys to the kingdom. Isabella's lips curved into a smile, but it was not a smile he had ever seen before. It was cool, controlled, and held a hint of something he could only describe as pity. "This is no costume, Julian. As for the briefcase, I suppose you could call it my inheritance." Arthur Vance let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Your inheritance, Mrs. Croft. With all due respect, the terms of the prenup are quite clear. You waived any and all claims to the Croft family estate. I waived my claims to Julian's estate," Isabella corrected him gently, her eyes still locked on her husband. "But I never waived my claims to Edward's." Julian felt a cold dread begin to seep into his bones, a feeling so alien it was disorienting. He was Julian Croft. He didn't feel dread. He inspired it. "My father left everything to me," he said, the words a blunt instrument. It was his dying wish. The will was read, executed, and settled years ago. You were a stranger to him. "Were I?" Isabella replied, her voice soft but carrying an undeniable weight. She reached for the clasps on the old briefcase. The metallic clicks sounded like gunshots in the silent room. "Your father and I had many conversations, Julian. In the last year of his life, when you were too busy closing deals and jet-setting to notice he was fading, he and I became close." She opened the briefcase. Inside, nestled against the aged satin lining, was a single thick envelope sealed with the familiar waxen crest of the Croft family. But the seal was not Julian's. It was his father's, and next to it lay another document, crisp and official, bearing the letterhead of the New York State Surrogates Court. "Your father was a brilliant man." Julian Isabella continued her gaze, now sweeping over the stunned faces of his legal team. He was also a deeply disappointed one. He saw the man you were becoming, the arrogance, the cruelty. He feared you would run his life's work into the ground, not through incompetence, but through sheer hubris. She slid the sealed envelope across the table towards Julian. Her movements were fluid, graceful, the movements of a woman completely in control. He didn't trust you to do the right thing, so he made a contingency plan, a final testament, one that would only be revealed under a very specific set of circumstances. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the suffocatingly quiet room. "The day you tried to cast aside his grandchild's mother, with nothing but pocket change." Julian stared at the envelope. His name was not on it. In his father's familiar, spidery handwriting were the words, "To be opened by Isabella Rossi Croft, on the day of her divorce from my son." Arthur Vance finally snapped out of his stupor. "This is preposterous, a theatrical stunt. Any subsequent will would have been invalidated by the one we filed. This is meaningless." "Is it, Arthur?" Isabella asked, her voice turning sharp as steel. She slid the second document towards the lawyer. "This is a court order filed this morning. It validates this will as the true and final testament of Edward Croft, citing compelling evidence of the original probate being filed under fraudulent pretenses." It seems my father's long-time personal attorney, a man far more loyal to him than to his son, kept this document safe for me. He was quite appalled to hear about the divorce and the circumstances surrounding it. She looked back at Julian, her eyes holding his captive. The demure, silent wife was gone, replaced by a queen who had just checkmated the king. "You see, Julian," she said, her voice dropping to an almost conversational tone that was more terrifying than any shout. "Your father didn't leave his company to you. He left it in trust, a trust that you would control so long as you remained a worthy steward of his legacy, a legacy of family honor and decency. The will contains a morality clause, a very, very specific one. And you, my dear husband, have just violated it in the most spectacular way possible." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Julian Croft, a man who had built his identity on the unshakable foundation of control, felt the ground crumble beneath his feet. The air in the room, once thick with his own self-importance, was now heavy with a silence that was both accusing and absolute. His lawyers, the so-called sharks, looked like beached fish, their mouths opening and closing with no sound emerging. Arthur Vance was the first to recover, snatching the court order from the table. His eyes, usually darting and assessing, were now wide, scanning the legal jargon with a frantic desperation. He paled. The document was authentic. The seal was unbroken. The judge's signature was one he recognized and feared. It was a legal masterstroke, a perfectly executed ambush. This is an outrage." Arthur sputtered, his voice cracking. "We will challenge this. This is undue influence." She manipulated a dying man. Isabella didn't even grace him with a glance. Her attention was fixed like a laser on Julian. Manipulated him. She repeated a sad, ironic laugh escaping her lips. "Oh, Arthur, you have no idea. Edward and I discussed everything. We talked about art, literature, politics. We talked about his childhood, the struggles he faced building his company from the ground up. And yes, we talked about Julian. A lot." She finally broke her gaze with her husband and turned to Arthur. "You will find," she said, her tone crisp and businesslike, "that my father-in-law, Edward Croft, made me a signatory on his personal accounts 6 months before he died. He also granted me a durable power of attorney. He was of sound mind, and his personal physicians and a court-appointed psychiatrist will all testify to that effect. He knew exactly what he was doing. Her words were precise, each one a perfectly aimed dart, puncturing the bloated balloon of their arrogance." Julian felt a wave of nausea. He remembered those last months. He'd been busy with the acquisition of a rival tech firm in Asia. He had visited his father, of course. Brief, perfunctory visits where he'd talk at the old man about his latest triumphs, barely registering the weary sadness in his father's eyes. He had seen Isabella there, reading to his father, or playing chess with him, and had dismissed it as her wifely duty, a way to make herself useful. He had never imagined this. "Open it," Julian Isabella commanded softly. His hands trembled as he reached for the thick, cream-colored envelope. The wax seal bearing his father's crest felt warm, almost alive. He broke it with a clumsy finger, his usual decisiveness gone. He pulled out a sheaf of heavy parchment covered in his father's elegant cursive script. He began to read, his eyes flying across the page. The document began with the standard legal formalities, but then it shifted into a deeply personal and utterly devastating letter. "My dearest Julian, if you are reading this, it means you have failed. You have failed me. You have failed the family name and you have failed the one person who showed you unwavering loyalty and kindness when you least deserved it. You have chosen the path of arrogance and cruelty, the very things I fought to overcome in my own life, the very things I prayed you would rise above. Julian's breath hitched. His father's voice, so long silenced by death, was speaking to him from the page, and it was a voice of profound, gut-wrenching disappointment. The will continued laying out the terms in excruciating detail. It spoke of the Croft Holdings empire not as a personal piggy bank, but as a legacy. It was a living entity, Edward wrote, built on the sweat and loyalty of thousands of employees. It was a responsibility, not a right. Then came the morality clause. It was brutal in its specificity. The control of my estate vested in the Julian Croft Trust. Julian read aloud, his voice a hoarse whisper, is contingent upon my son, upholding the values of family and honor upon which this company was built. Specifically, should Julian initiate a divorce from his wife, Isabella Rossi Croft, for any reason other than infidelity on her part, and should he fail to provide for her in a manner befitting her station and her contribution to his life, and most critically to the life of my grandchild, then the terms of this trust shall be immediately and irrevocably altered. Julian's eyes darted down the page, searching for a loophole, a way out. There was none. His father, the master strategist, had thought of everything. The will then laid out the consequences of his transgression. First, his position as CEO and chairman of Croft Holdings was to be terminated effective immediately. Second, his control over the Julian Croft Trust, the entity that held the vast majority of his shares and assets, was to be dissolved. Third, a new primary beneficiary of the Edward Croft estate was to be named. Julian's blood ran cold as he read the next paragraph. In the event of the aforementioned clause being triggered, I hereby bequeath 60% of the total shares of Croft Holdings to Isabella Rossi Croft in trust for my grandchild. This trust will be managed by her with full voting rights and executive authority until my grandchild reaches the age of 25. She will assume the role of chairwoman of the board, effective immediately. 60%. The number hung in the air, a monstrous, unbelievable figure. It was a controlling stake. It was the entire kingdom. He, Julian Croft, was being dethroned. But his father wasn't finished. The will was a work of posthumous vengeance, designed not just to disinherit him, but to utterly humiliate him. A further 20% of the shares the will continued shall be placed into an employee stock ownership plan to be distributed among all full-time employees who have served Croft Holdings for more than 5 years. It is they who are the true foundation of this company, and it is time their loyalty was rewarded. 20% to the employees, an act of corporate heresy in Julian's cutthroat world. And what of Julian himself? To my son Julian, the will concluded, I leave the remaining 20% of the shares. This will provide him with a comfortable income, provided he learns to live more modestly than he is accustomed. He will retain a seat on the board, but he will hold no executive power. It is my hope, my final dying hope, that from this diminished position, he might finally learn the lesson that eluded him in his wealth and power, that a man's worth is not measured by what he owns, but by how he treats those who have nothing to give him but their love. Julian dropped the papers onto the table as if they were on fire. He stared at Isabella, his face a mask of disbelief and incandescent rage. You, he seethed the word a venomous hiss. You did this, you snake. You gold-digging whore! You played us all!" Isabella did not flinch. She stood her ground, her expression a mixture of sorrow and steel. "No, Julian," she said quietly. "You did this to yourself. Your father gave you everything, and you valued none of it. He saw it. He knew it. And he loved you enough to try and save you from yourself, even from beyond the grave." She picked up the court order and placed it squarely in front of Arthur Vance. "The transfer of shares is already being processed. The board is being notified as we speak. I believe my first official act as chairwoman will be to call an emergency meeting for this afternoon." She looked at the assembled lawyers, her gaze sweeping over them with cool dismissal. "As for you gentlemen, your services to Croft Holdings are no longer required. You will be compensated for your time today, of course. From Julian's personal accounts, not the company's." She then turned her back on them all and walked towards the door, her composure absolute. She paused at the threshold, her hand on the handle, and looked back at her vanquished husband, a man who in the space of 10 minutes had gone from king to a mere court jester in his own empire. "Oh, and Julian," she added, her voice soft, but carrying the final devastating blow. "The penthouse, the cars, the jet, they were all purchased through the company, weren't they? I'll need the keys by the end of the day. I wouldn't want you to be accused of trespassing." And with that, she was gone, leaving behind a silence so profound it was a scream, and a man who had just lost everything. The silence Isabella left in her wake was a living thing, a malevolent presence that pressed in on Julian from all sides. For a full minute he was frozen, his mind a chaotic whirlwind of denial and fury. The words on the page, his father's words, swirled before his eyes, mocking him. 60%. Chairwoman, you have failed. Then the dam of his composure broke. With a primal roar of rage, he swept his arm across the mahogany table. Pens, notepads, glasses of water, and the billion-dollar divorce settlement papers went flying, scattering across the floor like so much garbage. The sound of shattering glass echoed the shattering of his world. "No!" He screamed, his voice raw with disbelief. "This is not happening. This is a joke. A sick, twisted joke." Arthur Vance and his team flinched back, their faces pale. The sharks had lost their teeth. They were now just men in expensive suits, staring at a client who was imploding before their very eyes. "Julian." "Calm down," Arthur said, taking a hesitant step forward. "We need to think. There are legal avenues. We can file an injunction contest, the probate. Contest it with what Julian rounded on him." His eyes wild. "She has a court order. She has my father's doctors. She has his lawyer. He spent the last year of his life plotting my downfall with my own wife. The absurdity of it, the sheer theatrical betrayal was what galled him the most. He had seen himself as the ultimate puppet master, yet all along he had been the puppet. His quiet, submissive wife and his dying, disappointed father had been pulling the strings. He sank into his chair, the rage momentarily replaced by a cold, hollowing despair. He stared at the damning will, his father's signature, a final condemning flourish. He began to remember. Fragments of memory, previously insignificant, now clicked into place with horrifying clarity. He remembered Isabella, sitting by his father's bedside, not just reading novels, but reading aloud from the Wall Street Journal, discussing market trends and stock fluctuations. He had found it quaint, even amusing. "Look at my little wife playing businesswoman," he'd once joked to a friend. He remembered her asking him questions about the company's logistics division, about their supply chain vulnerabilities. He had been dismissive, patting her on the head and telling her not to worry her pretty little head about such complex matters. Now he realized she hadn't been making small talk. She had been conducting research. He remembered a heated argument with his father a few months before he died. Julian had wanted to sell off the company's oldest manufacturing plant, a legacy asset that was barely breaking even to fund a flashy new venture in cryptocurrency. His father had been furious. That plant was the cornerstone of this company. Edward had thundered, his voice weak, but his eyes blazing. It employs 300 people, Julian. People who have given their lives to this family. You don't just throw them away for a speculative gamble, Julian had scoffed. It's called progress, father. You're sentimental. You can't let emotion cloud business judgment. Emotion, his father had retorted, a look of profound sorrow on his face. What you call emotion, I call humanity. It's the thing you seem to have misplaced. At the time, Julian had dismissed it as the ramblings of an old man, out of touch with the modern world. Now he saw it for what it was, a final test. A test he had failed spectacularly. His phone began to buzz incessantly on the floor where it had fallen. Then Arthur's phone began to buzz, and then the phones of the other two lawyers. The news was breaking. The notifications would be flooding in from Bloomberg, from the Financial Times, from every major news outlet. Shake-up at Croft Holdings. Julian Croft ousted as CEO. Mysterious heir takes control. His life wasn't just falling apart. It was being publicly dissected. The humiliation was a physical pain, a fire in his gut. He looked at Arthur, a new desperate hope flickering in his eyes. The prenup. What about the prenup? She signed it. She waived her rights. Arthur Vance shook his head, slowly, his face grim. The prenup is irrelevant, Julian. This isn't about a division of marital assets. This is about an inheritance, a direct bequest from your father. The prenup protects your assets from her. It doesn't protect you from your own father's will. The logic was simple, brutal, and inescapable. The door to the conference room opened again. This time it wasn't Isabella. It was a woman Julian recognized, Maria, his father's personal assistant, for over 40 years. A quiet, unassuming woman he had always treated as part of the furniture. She was holding an iPad. She didn't look at Julian. She addressed the room. "Excuse me. Ms. Croft has called an emergency board meeting for 2:30 p.m. via Zoom. The link has just been sent out. Ms. Croft." Not Mrs. Croft. The distinction was a small, sharp stab to his ego. Then Maria's gaze finally settled on Julian, and for the first time in all the years he had known her, he saw not deference, but a cool, undisguised contempt. "Mr. Edward," she said, her voice trembling slightly with an emotion he now recognized as righteous. Anger. "Loved you very much, Julian. He worried about you every day. He saw the good man you could have been, and he saw the man you chose to be." She placed a small, simple object on the table next to the will. It was an old silver locket. "Isabella gave this to him," Maria said. "It has a picture of her ultrasound inside. He carried it with him every day until he died. He called the baby his little hope. He said this child, his grandchild, was the future of the Croft legacy, a future he had to protect. From you." With that final, devastating pronouncement, she turned and walked out, leaving Julian staring at the locket, the last piece of the puzzle, the final confirmation of the depth of his blindness. He had been so consumed with his own power, so certain of his own brilliance, that he had never truly seen the people around him. He had not seen the intelligence and strength in his wife, the profound disappointment in his father, or the quiet loyalty of those who had served his family for decades. He had seen only reflections of himself, extensions of his will. And in his arrogance, he had provided them with the very weapon they needed to bring him down. The ultimate irony was not lost on him. In trying to secure his absolute freedom, he had orchestrated his own imprisonment. He was trapped not by walls or bars, but by his own name, his own legacy now wielded by the woman he had tried to discard. The king was not just checkmated. He had been comprehensively and utterly erased from the board. While Julian was descending into his personal hell, Isabella was ascending. She returned not to the cold, opulent penthouse that had been her gilded cage, but to a place she hadn't entered in 5 years, the original Croft family mansion on the Upper East Side. It was a stately limestone monolith, a relic of old New York money and power. Julian had always found it stuffy and outdated, preferring the sleek, modern anonymity of his glass tower in the sky. But for Edward, and now for Isabella, it was the heart of the empire. The staff, many of whom had served the family since before Julian was born, greeted her not with surprise, but with quiet, respectful deference. They had been informed. Maria, ever efficient, had made the calls. "Welcome home, Opamisul," Croft said, the elderly butler, his eyes shining with unshed tears of loyalty. "Thank you, Thomas," she replied, her voice warm. "It's good to be back." She didn't pause or hesitate. She walked with purpose through the grand foyer, past the portraits of stern-faced Croft ancestors, and went straight to the one room Julian had never willingly entered his father's study. It was a sanctuary of dark wood, worn leather, and the smell of old books and pipe tobacco. Nothing had been changed since Edward's death. His reading glasses still lay on a copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. His favorite chess set, a beautiful ivory creation, was still set up on a side table, a game unfinished. Isabella ran her hand over the back of his large leather chair. This was where the plan had been born. In this room, during long afternoons and quiet evenings, a dying patriarch and his underestimated daughter-in-law had forged an alliance. He had seen past the quiet facade to the sharp, strategic mind beneath. He had been a lonely man, watching his son become a caricature of everything he despised. In Isabella he had found a kindred spirit, a worthy successor, who understood that true power was not about domination, but about responsibility. He had mentored her, taught her the intricacies of the business, the histories of every division, the strengths and weaknesses of every executive. He had given her the education that Julian in his arrogance had denied her. And she had been a brilliant student. Now it was time for her first lesson as chairwoman. At exactly 200 p.m., she sat behind her father-in-law's immense mahogany desk, the very seat of his power, and opened her laptop to join the emergency board meeting. One by one, the faces of the board members appeared on the screen. They were a gallery of the rich and powerful titans of industry, grizzled financiers, and influential socialites. Their expressions ranged from utter bewilderment to thinly veiled hostility. They were Julian's people, his allies, his enablers. And then one final window opened. It was Julian. His face was puffy, his eyes red-rimmed. He was sitting in the soulless conference room, a ghost at his own funeral. He had a seat on the board, his father's final cruel mercy. But he was now just one face among many, and the smallest one at that, holding only a minority stake. Isabella took a deep, steadying breath and began. Good afternoon, everyone, she said, her voice calm and authoritative. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Isabella Rossi Croft. As per the final and binding will of the late Edward Croft, which has been legally validated and executed this morning, I have assumed the role of chairwoman of the board of Croft Holdings, effective immediately. A wave of stunned silence and frantic private messages between board members rippled across the Zoom call. I know this is unexpected, she continued, and I understand you will have many questions. Rest assured, transparency will be a cornerstone of my leadership. However, our first order of business is to stabilize the company and reassure our investors and employees. To that end, I am announcing some immediate changes. She laid out her vision with a clarity and confidence that stunned them into submission. She wasn't tearing the company down. She was rebuilding it from the foundations up, according to her and Edward's shared vision. First, she announced the immediate reversal of Julian's plan to sell the old manufacturing plant. The Croft legacy was built on making things, not just on making money. She stated, echoing Edward's words. We will invest in that plant, modernize it, and make it a model of 21st century manufacturing. The employees who have given us their loyalty deserve nothing less. Second, she addressed the 20% employee stock ownership plan. Our greatest asset is our people. I am appointing a committee led by employees themselves to oversee the fair and equitable distribution of these shares. From this day forward, every employee will have a tangible stake in our shared success. Third, she announced a comprehensive review of all executive compensation packages, including her own. The era of rewarding greed is over. From now on, compensation will be tied not just to profits, but to ethical conduct, employee satisfaction, and our company's contribution to the community. Julian could only watch impotent as the empire he had treated as his personal playground was systematically reshaped into something he barely recognized. Every word she spoke was a repudiation of his entire philosophy, his very being. It was a public vivisection of his reign. One of the older board members, a long-time crony of Julian's, finally found his voice. With all due respect, Miss Croft, you have no experience running a company of this magnitude. This is idealistic. It's not how the real world works. Isabella met his gaze through the screen, her expression unyielding. You are mistaken, Mr. Henderson. I have had the finest mentor one could ask for the man who built this company. And as for my experience, you are correct that I have not been a CEO before. That is why my first act as chairwoman is to appoint a new one. A collective gasp went through the virtual room. I am promoting Sarah Jenkins, the current Chief Operating Officer, to the position of Chief Executive Officer, Isabella announced. This was a masterstroke. Sarah Jenkins was a brilliant, universally respected executive who had risen through the ranks on sheer talent. She was also a woman Julian had consistently overlooked and undermined, threatened by her competence. By promoting her, Isabella was not only installing a capable leader, but also signaling a complete break from the toxic, misogynistic culture of the old guard. Sarah will handle the day-to-day operations, Isabella concluded. As chairwoman, my focus will be on long-term strategy, ethical governance, and ensuring that Croft Holdings once again becomes a name synonymous not just with wealth, but with honor. Are there any further questions? There were none. They were utterly routed. They saw in her not the timid wife of a billionaire, but the true heir of Edward Croft, a leader with a will of iron and a vision that was both radical and deeply rooted in the company's own history. As she ended the call, Isabella allowed herself a small, weary smile. The first battle was won. She leaned back in her father-in-law's chair, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. This was for him, for her child, and for the future he had entrusted to her. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Julian's name was scrubbed from the company website. His corporate accounts were frozen. His company credit cards were cancelled mid-charge at a 5-star restaurant where he was drowning his sorrows. The eviction notice for the penthouse was delivered by a stony-faced courier. He was forced to move his belongings into a suite at the Four Seasons, a luxury that for the first time he had to pay for himself. His 20% stake would still make him a rich man, but he had lost the one thing he truly cared about: his power. He was no longer the king. He was just another wealthy spectator. That evening, as Isabella walked through the quiet halls of the mansion, she paused at the chess table. She studied the half-finished game, recognizing the positions. It was a game she had been playing with Edward. He had been teaching her, using the pieces to illustrate strategies of foresight, sacrifice, and control. She looked at the board and saw it clearly. Edward had deliberately left his king in a vulnerable position, sacrificing it to allow his queen to sweep across the board and dominate. It was his final lesson. With a steady hand, Isabella picked up her ivory queen. She moved it across the board in a single decisive move. "Checkmate," she whispered into the silent room. For 3 months, Isabella's reign was a whirlwind of transformative action. Guided by her CEO, Sarah Jenkins Croft, Holdings underwent a radical metamorphosis. The stock price, after an initial wobble, stabilized and then began to climb as investors, weary of Julian's erratic, ego-driven leadership, responded to the new era of stability and ethical purpose. The employee stock plan was a massive success, boosting morale and productivity to unprecedented levels. Isabella was hailed in the press as a visionary, a refreshing new face in the staid world of corporate governance. She was the woman who had tamed the beast, not by killing it, but by reminding it of its soul. Julian, meanwhile, festered. From his gilded cage at the Four Seasons, he watched her every move with a venomous obsession. He was a pariah. His old friends, the ones who had laughed at his jokes and drunk his vintage champagne, now crossed the street to avoid him. He was a cautionary tale whispered about at exclusive country clubs and charity galas. He had become a ghost in the machine he had once commanded. His days were a monotonous cycle of bitterness. He would wake late, read the fawning articles about Isabella's leadership, and then call his new, less prestigious lawyers to explore legal challenges that grew more futile by the day. They had filed appeals motions and injunctions. All were summarily dismissed. The will was ironclad. Edward Croft, with Isabella's help, had constructed a legal fortress. But Julian was not a man to accept defeat. If the law wouldn't work, he would find another way. He began to dig. He hired private investigators, forensic accountants, anything to find a crack in Isabella's armor. He was convinced she had a secret, a weakness he could exploit to bring her down and reclaim his throne. He spent millions of his dwindling personal fortune searching for a skeleton in her closet. And then he found one. It came from an anonymous tip emailed to his lawyer from an encrypted server. The email was short and cryptic. Ask about the Geneva conference, the one before she met you. Ask about a man named Alexei Volkov. The name meant nothing to Julian, but the hunt was on. His investigators dug deep into Isabella's past, a past he had never bothered to learn about. They discovered that a year before he had met her, Isabella had worked as a translator for a highly sensitive negotiation in Geneva between a Swiss technology firm and a shadowy Russian conglomerate headed by a man named Alexei Volkov. Volkov was a notorious oligarch, a man with deep ties to the Kremlin and a reputation for ruthless business practices that often blurred the line into criminality. The deal had fallen through at the last minute. The Swiss company had pulled out citing irreconcilable ethical concerns, shortly after their proprietary source code for a revolutionary new AI platform had been stolen. The theft was never solved, but whispers had always pointed to Volkov's organization. Julian's heart pounded as he read the report. This was it. This was the leverage he needed. Isabella was at the center of a major corporate espionage case. If he could prove she was involved, that she had been Volkov's inside woman, he could destroy her. He could paint her as a corporate spy, a fraud, a criminal. The board, the investors, the public, they would all turn on her. The morality clause in his father's will was about family and honor. What was more dishonorable than this? He decided to make his move not in a courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. He leaked the story carefully curated and dripping with insinuation to a notoriously aggressive financial journalist known for his sensationalist takedowns. The headline exploded across the internet. Croft Holdings chairwoman linked to Russian oligarch in decade-old espionage scandal. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The company's stock plummeted. The board was in a panic. The carefully constructed image of Saint Isabella, the corporate savior, was shattered overnight. The ghost was back in the machine, and he was a virus. An emergency board meeting was called, but this time the atmosphere was different. The deference was gone, replaced by suspicion and fear. Julian joined the call from his lawyer's office, a triumphant smirk on his face for the first time in months. He was no longer the pathetic ghost. He was the avenging angel, Isabella. One of the board members said, his voice grave, "You need to address these allegations. Is there any truth to them? Did you work for Alexei Volkov?" All eyes were on Isabella. She sat in her father-in-law's study, her face pale, but her expression composed. Her pregnancy was more pronounced now, and she rested a protective hand on her belly as if drawing strength from the life within. "Yes," she said quietly. "I was the lead translator on that project, a collective intake of breath." Julian's smirk widened. He had her. And did you know, Julian interjected, his voice dripping with false concern, that the Swiss company's most valuable intellectual property was stolen shortly after those negotiations collapsed, a theft that has been linked to this Alexei Volkov. "Yes," Isabella said again, her eyes finding his on the screen. "I am aware of that. And what would you say," Julian pressed, going in for the kill, "if I told you we have evidence suggesting that you were the one who facilitated that theft? That you were Volkov's mole?" He was bluffing about the evidence, but it didn't matter. The accusation was enough. He watched her, waiting for her to crumble, to deny, to lie. But Isabella did none of those things. Instead, a strange soul smile touched her lips. "I would say you are as usual half right and completely wrong, Julian," she said, her voice regaining its strength. "I did not facilitate the theft. I prevented it." She looked around at the stunned faces of the board members. "The Swiss company Kalis Technologies hired me as a translator. But I soon realized that Volkov was not interested in a partnership. He was using the negotiations as a cover to plant a mole and steal their AI code. I discovered who the mole was, one of their own senior engineers, who was in debt to Volkov. I gathered the evidence. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. But I was in a difficult position. I was a 24-year-old translator. Who would believe me over a senior engineer? So I went not to the Swiss authorities, but to someone I knew had the power and the discretion to handle it. Someone with a vested interest in stopping a man like Volkov. Julian's triumphant smile began to fade, replaced by a creeping sense of unease. He didn't like where this was going. Isabella continued. I went to the head of a rival company, a man who also happened to be the patriarch of a powerful American family, a man who was known for his integrity and his deep distrust of men like Volkov. He met with me secretly in Geneva. He reviewed my evidence, and he believed me. He used his influence to quietly warn the CEO of Kalis Technologies, allowing them to pull out of the deal and neutralize the mole without a public scandal that would have destroyed their reputation. She looked directly at Julian, her gaze piercing and resolute. That man, she said, her voice ringing with clarity, was your father. Edward Croft. The silence that followed was absolute. Julian felt the blood drain from his face. It couldn't be. Edward and I didn't meet for the first time. When you brought me to New York. Julian. Isabella revealed her voice, softening. We had already known each other for a year. It was your father who, impressed with my actions in Geneva, encouraged me to move to the United States. It was your father who subtly orchestrated the circumstances under which you and I would meet. He had hoped that a woman who shared his values might be a good influence on you. She gave a small, sorrowful shake of her head. It seems he miscalculated on that point. But he never forgot what I did. He saw me as a protector of his own values, long before I ever became the part of his family. The entire story is documented in his personal journals. The one sitting right here in his desk. She held up a leather-bound journal. He called the file The Geneva Gambit, she said. Your investigators, Julian, are good at digging up dirt, but they, like you, only ever look for the worst in people. They never thought to look for the truth. Julian was speechless. He had walked directly into a trap more complex and more deeply laid than he could ever have imagined. He had thought he was a ghost haunting the machine, but he was just a pawn in a game that had started long before he even knew it was being played. He had tried to expose a skeleton in Isabella's closet, only to find it was the very foundation upon which her kingdom was built. He hadn't just lost his company. He had lost the entire narrative, the very history he thought was his. In his desperate attempt to reclaim his past, he had only succeeded in cementing his own irrelevance for good. So the king was finally and utterly defeated, not by a hostile takeover or a market crash, but by the quiet, strategic brilliance of the queen he had so arrogantly underestimated. Julian Croft learned the hard way that a legacy is not just built on stock prices and acquisitions, but on character honor and the secrets you keep. Isabella, with her unborn child, the true Croft heir, proved that real power isn't seized, it's earned through integrity and a will of iron. She didn't just take his company, she reclaimed its soul. What do you think? Was this a story of sweet revenge, or a lesson in the ultimate cost of pride? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were captivated by this tale of drama and twisted fate, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a good story, and subscribe for more tales of fortune folly and the powerful secrets that can change everything in an instant.